Welcome back to Surprise Insights. Today, we're diving into the darkest corners of human history to reveal the 25 most brutal torture methods ever devised. This video isn't for the faint-hearted, but if you're curious to learn more about the lengths humans have gone to inflict pain, hit that subscribe button. Buckle up as we explore the haunting details that shaped some of history's darkest chapters. 25. The Tub. Known simply as the tub, this punishment was far from ordinary. The victim was seated in a wooden tub with only their head exposed, while executioners painted their face with milk and honey to attract flies. Over time, the victim would be trapped in their own filth as the insects began feeding on their flesh. Eventually, maggots and worms would infest the body, devouring it alive while the victim was still conscious. It was a slow, horrifying decay into death. 24. The Brazen Bull. Devised by Perillos of Athens, the brazen bull was a terrifying instrument of torture used in ancient Greece. Victims were locked inside a large bronze bowl with a fire lit beneath it to heat the metal. Ingeniously, the bowl was designed to make the screams of the victims sound like an animal's bellowing. This served not only to intensify the horror, but also to entertain the onlookers with a grotesque spectacle. The bowl left a lasting psychological scar on all who witnessed its dreadful performance. 23. Impalement. Impalement was a gruesome method of execution popularized by Vlad the Impaler, a figure whose reputation for cruelty was well-deserved. The victim would be hoisted onto a sharpened stake, with gravity slowly forcing them downward, impaling them over the course of hours or even days. Vlad famously dined among his impaled victims, their dying moans the only sound in the eerie silence. This method created an enduring symbol of fear that lingers in folklore to this day. The sheer agony and the visual horror made it a weapon of terror as much as punishment. 22. Heretic's Fork. The heretic's fork was a small yet devastating device that forced a metal prong between the victim's chin and chest. It was strapped in such a way that even the slightest nod would pierce their throat, effectively denying them any rest. Designed to torment both physically and psychologically, this device kept the prisoner awake, terrified, and in constant pain until exhaustion took its toll. The victim was left suspended in a state of perpetual terror, as sleep itself became a forbidden escape. For those accused of heresy, it was a long road to death. 21. Neck torture. This technique involved a spiked iron collar that held the victim's neck in a fixed position, preventing movement. Restricted and exposed to the elements, they endured hours or even days without the possibility of rest, food, or even the slightest relief. It wasn't just a test of physical endurance. It also played on the mind's desperation to escape. This torture often resulted in death from sheer exhaustion or starvation. It was as mentally excruciating as it was physically unbearable. 20. Crucifixion. Crucifixion is best known as the method by which Jesus Christ was killed, but its roots extend far beyond that single instance. Victims were nailed or tied to a wooden cross and left to die slowly, often over several days. Death was a result of asphyxiation, dehydration, and the strain on the body, which gradually collapsed under its own weight. Public crucifixions were meant to deter others, using the victim's prolonged suffering as a brutal warning. It remains one of the most iconic and feared forms of punishment throughout history. 19. Judas Cradle. The Judas Cradle, also known as the Spanish horse, was a torture device that involved a pyramid-shaped seat. Victims were lowered onto it, so that the sharp point would slowly impale them due to the force of their own weight. Infection was a common side effect, turning an already painful ordeal into a prolonged death sentence. This technique inflicted deep shame alongside physical agony, designed to break both body and spirit. Many who endured it died slowly from wounds that became gangrenous over time. 18. The Lead Sprinkler. At first glance, this device resembled a simple ladle or spoon, but it was far from harmless. The lead sprinkler was filled with molten metal, tar, or boiling oil, which was then dripped onto the victim's exposed skin or eyes. The slow, searing burn was intended to cause intense, localized pain, inflicting long-lasting injuries. Victims suffered both from the physical wounds and from the horror of watching their own flesh melt. The psychological trauma was nearly as torturous as the burn itself. 17. The Iron Maiden. Though many believe it to be a product of folklore, the Iron Maiden was indeed used for torment. This upright coffin-like structure was lined with sharp spikes that pierced the victim from multiple angles when it was closed. The spikes were positioned to avoid fatal injuries, keeping the victim alive and conscious of their pain. Enclosed in darkness and silence, victims could do little but suffer. It turned the very concept of confinement into an unspeakable horror. 16. Coffin torture. The coffin torture involved placing a victim into a metal cage, shaped roughly like a human body. The cage was often too small, contorting the victim into uncomfortable positions, which prevented them from any form of relief. They would then be hung from a tree or gallows, exposed to weather and animals, and left to perish in public view. The crows and other creatures often feasted on them while they were still alive. It was both a method of execution and a disturbing public display of power. 15. Thumbscrew. Simple yet excruciating, the thumbscrew was a tool designed to crush fingers, toes, or even limbs by applying increasing pressure. It was often used as a means of extracting confessions from accused individuals. The agonizing pressure could easily pulverize bones into dust, leaving lasting disabilities. Victims could do nothing to ease their suffering, held captive by the constant, merciless tightening. It was a painful reminder of how small tools could create monumental suffering. 14. Rope torture. While a simple tool, rope was used in cruel and varied ways to inflict suffering. Victims could be bound in painful positions, suspended by their limbs, or even attached to teams of horses that would pull in opposite directions. In some cases, people were hung upside down for extended periods, causing blood to pool in the head and resulting in extreme discomfort and eventual death. Rope torture demonstrated that even the most basic materials could become instruments of unimaginable cruelty when wielded without mercy. It often left survivors with lifelong injuries, if they survived at all. 13. Scaphism. Scaphism was a horrifying Persian method designed to prolong suffering as long as possible. The victim was tied between two boats or hollowed-out tree trunks, force-fed milk and honey until they developed severe diarrhea, and left floating in stagnant water. The milk and honey also attracted insects that would swarm, bite, and burrow into the victim's exposed flesh, adding to their torment. Days or even weeks of insect bites, infection, and dehydration would finally lead to death. Scaphism was a punishment reserved for those considered the worst of criminals, showing just how relentless and vengeful ancient justice could be. 12. Breaking wheel. Known as the Catherine wheel, this method involved securing the victim to a large wheel and systematically breaking their limbs with heavy metal bars. Executioners aimed to shatter every major bone, leaving the victim's body twisted and mangled in unimaginable agony. Often, they would be left to die slowly on the wheel, displayed as a cautionary tale to deter others. This form of punishment was both a physical and psychological torment, intended to strip away all dignity in a public spectacle of suffering. 11. Flaying. Flaying, the practice of removing a person's skin while they were still alive, was as horrifying as it sounds. Skilled torturers would begin peeling away the skin in strips, ensuring the victim remained conscious as long as possible. This barbaric practice was designed to not only inflict maximum pain but also to utterly dehumanize the individual, reducing them to a state of unimaginable suffering. It was often used to send a brutal message to others, highlighting the punishment's symbolic and punitive horror. 10. The Pear of Anguish. The Pear of Anguish was a deceptively small instrument used to administer internal torture. Inserted into the victim's mouth, anus, or other orifices, the device would be expanded slowly, causing excruciating internal tearing and bleeding. Though not always lethal, the device left victims in debilitating pain, often causing severe internal injuries. Its very design symbolized both physical and moral humiliation, as it was used on those accused of witchcraft, blasphemy, or unspeakable crimes. The suffering it inflicted was as subtle as it was devastating. 9. Rat torture. In this sinister form of torture, Rats were placed inside a cage on the victim's stomach or chest, with heat applied to the cage to drive the rats to escape. Unable to find a way out, the rats would begin burrowing into the victim's flesh. This method played on both the physical agony of bites and the psychological horror of being eaten alive. Rat torture was as much about terror as pain, making it an effective tool for extracting confessions or intimidating witnesses. The sight alone was enough to break the spirits of those forced to watch. 8. Knee splitter. This tool was as brutal as it sounds. 2 metal bars with sharp spikes were placed around the victim's knee. As the torturer turned a screw, the bars would crush the knee, tearing through bone and flesh with each turn. Knee splitters were typically used to extract information or confessions, with the threat of permanent injury looming over the victim. Even for survivors, the damage was often so severe that they were left crippled for life. It served as a lasting reminder of the consequences of defying authority. 7. Saw torture. This barbaric punishment involved hanging a person upside down, keeping blood flowing to the brain so they would remain conscious longer. Executioners would then begin sawing through the body, often starting at the groin and moving downward, with the victim feeling every agonizing cut. This method ensured maximum suffering, prolonging death as long as possible. Saw torture illustrated the lengths to which societies could go to maintain control through fear. The victims of this horrific practice served as a chilling reminder of authority's unyielding grip. 6. The head crusher. The head crusher was a vice-like instrument that applied pressure to the skull, gradually increasing until it crushed bones, teeth, and even eyes. With each turn of the screw, the skull caved in further, causing unimaginable pain. As the pressure built, the victim's teeth would shatter, eyes would burst, and eventually, the skull would collapse. This cruel invention was not only a means of execution, but a powerful message about the power of authority, as those who watched the torture would never forget the sight. 5. Crocodile shears. Crocodile shears were metal pincers with jagged teeth, heated until red hot, and then used to tear through fingers, toes, or other extremities. Used on traitors or would-be assassins, this punishment was not only painful, but also left victims permanently disfigured. The fear it instilled made it an effective deterrent, as it demonstrated that betrayal would be met with ruthless consequences. The painful dismemberment and resulting disabilities marked the victim forever, serving as a haunting symbol of their supposed disloyalty. 4. Tongue ripper. In eras where blasphemy or slander could result in severe punishment, the tongue ripper was a fear device. The metal clamp would seize hold of the tongue, tearing it out with one forceful pull. This method silenced those who spoke out, often leaving victims unable to speak for the rest of their lives. It wasn't only a punishment, but a permanent way of stifling dissent. Victims left with disfigured mouths served as a gruesome reminder to others to watch their words. 3. The Spanish donkey. This agonizing device, also known as the Spanish horse, involved a sharp wedge of wood on which victims were forced to sit. Weights were tied to their feet, pulling them down onto the wedge and causing it to slice into their body. The longer they sat, the deeper the wedge cut, eventually reaching bone. It was a slow and merciless form of torture, designed to create unbearable pain without the mercy of a swift death. The Spanish donkey was notorious for its brutality, leaving victims permanently scarred or worse. 2. The garrote. Used in various forms across Europe and the Americas, the garrote was a simple but effective device for strangulation. The victim's neck was placed in a metal collar, which would be tightened until they could no longer breathe. In some versions, a spike was added to the back, piercing the neck as the collar tightened. Though primarily a method of execution, the garrote's slow suffocation caused an agonizing, helpless end. It was a widely feared punishment that spoke to the ruthlessness of justice systems of the time. 1. Lingqi, death by 1,000 cuts. Originating in ancient China, Lingqi was a punishment reserved for the gravest offenses, often involving high-profile criminals or traitors. The executioner would carefully slice away parts of the victim's body over several hours, drawing out the suffering in an unimaginable way. The slow slicing was both a physical torment and a calculated psychological punishment, as it showed the full power of the emperor's authority. Ling Chi was eventually abolished, but its horrific reputation lives on as a testament to one of the most brutal practices ever enforced. Thank you for watching Surprise Insights. If you made it through this dark journey, you've seen just how far human cruelty can go. For more intriguing, spine-chilling, and surprising facts from history and beyond, subscribe to Surprise Insights. Let us know which of these left the deepest impression, and remember, there's always more to uncover.